Thank you, Peter. Thank you, everyone, for having me here today. So I'm going to take a slightly different view of the data. I'm going to use some of our real-world big-level data to examine this question, no relevant disclosures. So in the U.S., the Medicare insurance database is the primary insurer for the U.S. population. It's about 1 in 5 patients, mainly on the patients who are older than 65 or have significant disabilities. But the nice part about using this database is that we have follow-up data for all patients who are enrolled in the Medicare program. So we use this data set to really investigate this question looking at a different angle, but answer 2 similar questions. The first was, what is the mortality signal using the Medicare insurance claims database? And second, how does this signal look in a real-world, broad patient population that we're caring for on a daily basis? We use 2 different approaches. The first one, and this is dichotomized by the coding scheme for the claims. So the first looks at the ICD-10 coding scheme, and this allows us to look at both drug-coated balloons and drug-eluting stent devices. And the second used the more historical ICD-9 coding scheme, which allowed us to have a longer period of follow-up, but only looked at drug-eluting stents. So our first paper was published in JAMA Cardiology in early February. And for this analysis, we looked at over 16,000 Medicare patients who were admitted for a FEMPOP revascularization procedure in the year of 2016. We stratified patients whether they were treated with a drug-eluting stent or a drug-coated balloon versus non-drug-coated devices. The median follow-up was around 390 days, and we had longest follow-up for patients through 600 days. This is just an example of what ICD-10 coding does for our Medicare data set. We're able to both look at the arterial segment that was treated, the laterality, whether it was the right or left leg, as well as the type of device that was used or combination of devices. So a lot of granular information on the procedural side from a claims-based data set. These are the baseline characteristics. Just to highlight a few, the average age was 73, consistent with the Medicare data set. This was primarily a white population, and about half men, half women, and about half the patients had critical limb ischemia. And interestingly, those treated with drug-coated devices actually had more at-risk features, including more advanced age, more congestive heart failure, and more diabetes mellitus. This is the most important slide I'll show you out of all these data. This is all patients, all devices. In blue here is the non-drug treated group, and in yellow is the drug treated group. And as you can see in these Kaplan-Meier curves, it's extending out to 600 days. There was really, I don't want to focus on a mortality benefit, but there was no harm signal amongst those treated with drug-coated devices versus non-drug-coated devices. And when we adjust for patient, procedural, and hospital level characteristics in a Cox proportional regression model, we found no adjusted hazard for mortality associated with drug-coated devices. Now, you can chop up these data and look at it in many different ways. It's the balloon angioplasty alone group, so DCB versus uncoated balloon. No mortality difference, no adjusted hazard ratio. In the stenting group, drug-eluting stent versus bare metal stent, overlapping curves here. Adjusted analysis, no signal for harm. And again, when you look at the critical limb ischemia population, which was about half this Medicare population, we saw a high mortality group in each arm. It's a high-risk population, but no mortality difference whether they're treated with a drug-coated or non-drug-coated device through 600 days, both in unadjusted and adjusted analyses. Probably one of the more groups that we're very interested in are the non-CLI groups, the atypical symptomatic patients and claudicants. Again, lower mortality risk than the CLI, but no mortality signal with drug-coated devices. Doesn't matter in unadjusted or unadjusted or in adjusted analyses. So what we concluded from this is there is no difference in survival between drug-coated and uncoated devices, both in CLI and non-CLI patients. Some of the limitations that were brought up was obviously the limited amount of follow-up. The median was 389 days, but we followed patients through 600 days. And I'll say this, if you're gonna see a 3.5% mortality difference at 2 years, you're gonna probably see those curves starting to separate before, and we saw no signal of that in this analysis. In addition, I understand that this is not a randomized trial population, but these are the patients we're treating. These are the patients that are being admitted to our hospitals. These are the patients that we care about. So I think that these patients and the lack of signal here is incredibly important. I'm just going to show you briefly our second analysis that was published on JACC in early March. This was over 50,000 Medicare beneficiaries treated from December 2012 through November 2015, and this timed with the release of the Zilver PTX in the US, the FDA approval. We looked at all-cause mortality on a median of 2 years, and we had patients out through 4.1 years of follow-up. And again, this was with the more traditional ICD-9 coding system for drug-eluting or bare metal stents. Again, similar population as the ICD-10 first analysis I showed you, an average age of 73, about over 50% of CLI, high risk of diabetes and renal failure in this patient population. And this is just the general uptake in orange here of the drug-eluting stent, Zilver, and non-Zilver-based therapies in the US. We can see by the end of 2015, about 11% of patients were being treated with these devices. So for all patients in this study, we found, again, here in red is drug-eluting stent, green is bare metal stent, no difference in crude survival out through 4.1 years of follow-up. Curves are nearly overlapping. We adjust for patient procedural characteristics, no adjusted risk of mortality. You cut it up by CLI versus non-CLI. Again, the curves are nearly overlapping. No difference in survival through 4.1 years, doesn't matter in CLI or non-CLI. So in conclusion, among a real-world patient population in the US, Medicare beneficiaries, we found no midterm or long-term survival differences between patients treated with drug-coated and uncoated devices. And it didn't matter how you looked at this data, which device or which patient population, we found no signal. Thank you.